Hi. I kind of made this penguin. I say kind of because, as with most things when working at Club Penguin, it was a group effort. But if you, wonderful internet viewer, were looking for the guy who animated this penguin or figured out how it should wear clothes, that's me. If you've ever asked yourself how this penguin was made or why we decided to give him such a strange dance, this is the video for you. But I can't start a video about Club Penguin's avatar without talking about the avatars that came before. The first version of what became Club Penguin started in the year 2000 with a fun little web tool called Experimental Penguins. Created by Lance Priebe and inspired partially by this Far Side cartoon, the first penguins for Experimental Penguins looked like this. I still love these little penguins. They're like little walking guitar picks. From 2001 to 2004, Experimental Penguins was updated into newer versions. Penguin Chat 2 revised the penguin into something much more recognizable for what we see today, and introduced the Penguin Band. Penguin Chat 3's penguin was virtually unchanged from number 2, but when the founders of Club Penguin decided that they wanted to give Penguin Chat 3 a big update into a product worth paying for, they realized that the current penguin avatar had some problems. Problem number 1, changing color. Penguin Chat 3 could do it, but only by swapping one penguin for another. Problem number 2, clothes. Penguin Chat 3 didn't have any, except for the ninja outfit, which was only possible by swapping out the penguin in the same way colors worked, and that solution would not work if we wanted 100 interchangeable clothing items. Problem number 3, animations. The Penguin Chat 3 avatar penguin had animations, but were they the right animations for a larger game? Someone would need to be hired to figure out the answer to all of those questions, and that someone was me. I started working on Club Penguin in May 2005, and my first assignment was to revise the penguin avatar for this new update to Penguin Chat. Let me explain the absurdity of this. Lance asked me, a 22-year-old student fresh out of animation school who has never actually had a job in the animation or video game industry, to create the avatar for Club Penguin. And due to the importance of this, whatever decisions I made at this point in the project would be decisions that we would have to live with for the entire life of the game. No pressure. If any of us knew how big Club Penguin was going to get, I'm not sure they would have asked me, but nobody knew, so I got to work. I was aware of the main things I needed to do to improve the penguin avatar, but before I went into addressing the 3 issues, I had a decision to make. 2D or 3D? It often comes as a surprise to some fans to discover that the little penguin that waddled around in their childhood was actually a 3D model, and always had been. Penguin Chat had a 3D model, even Experimental Penguins had a 3D model. But should Club Penguin keep this, or should something be redesigned? A 2D penguin would have been a possibility, with the animations looking more puppeted like the animations in, say, Scribblenauts. But Lance had already proven a very distinct look with Penguin Chat, rendering 3D objects as flat 2D vectors, and I wanted to try and make that work first. But how to solve the problems with the existing avatar? Number 1, color changing. This one was easy. Flash had the ability to turn portions of the art within it into groups called symbols, and then tint those symbols any color. So we just render the penguin, tint the penguin a different color, and... oh. Right. That's okay. This is still relatively easy. We just need another step. We render the penguin as it's supposed to look, and then separate the penguin into 2 layers, a color tint layer and an overlay. The color tint layer would contain any part of the penguin's body that needed to change color, and the tint would be controlled through code. The overlay would contain everything else: eyes, beak, feet, tummy, and shadows. Number 2, clothes. This one was more complicated. Step 1, create a clothing item in 3D. Step 2, render the penguin wearing that piece of clothing for all of its animations. Step 3, import the render into Flash. Step 4, select and delete every part of the penguin, leaving just the clothing item behind. Step 5. Save it as a separate file so that it can appear on top of the penguin as an additional layer. This is how every single clothing item on Club Penguin was made, with some exceptions. Recolored clothing items didn't have to be created in 3D. If we had a red cape and wanted a blue one, we'd just color it differently. No problem. This flow worked great, though I did have an early art concern. You see, when I rendered the penguin into 3D, I rendered it with shadows turned on. Without the shadows, the penguin looked like it had no depth. The shadow of the beak and of the body gave it weight and made it feel like it was part of the world. However, those shadows were also a pain, because everything cast a shadow. The eyes cast a shadow, and so after I rendered the penguin and imported it into Flash, I'd need to go frame by frame and delete the shadows in areas where I didn't want shadow. I didn't want to have to do this for every single clothing item. The shadows would have to be tweaked for every item, and multiple clothing items' shadows would overlap each other and look weird, so I made an executive decision. The penguin would have shadows, but the clothing would not. I had some genuine concern that players would think this would look weird, but in all of my time looking at Club Penguin fan feedback, you know how many times anyone pointed out that the clothes did not cast shadow on themselves? 0. Respond in the comments if you did notice the lack of clothing shadow and it really bothered you, or if you didn't notice and are having your mind blown. I'm genuinely curious about both. Number 3, animations. Alright, the question of what animations to give the penguin was an important one, because every standard animation that the penguin had meant rendering each clothing item so that it could support performing that animation. This meant giving the penguins as few animations as possible and making those animations versatile so that they could be used in many different ways. Penguin Chat 3 had 8 directions of standing, which was actually 5 directions because of fancy mirror flipping, 4 directions of sitting, which were 2 directions mirror flipped, 8 directions of walking, 8 directions of snowball throwing, and a dance. This dance was made mostly out of existing frames from the other animations, which I took special note of because that was a clever way of reusing assets. How did Club Penguin compare? Well, I liked the Penguin Chat 3 assortment, but I was concerned about the 8 directions of snowball throwing. Did I really want to render out and deal with complicated body items throwing a snowball in every single cardinal direction? I also added a few new things. One was the wave, which I believed would be important as a way to get people's attention or greet them. The other was the dance. Penguin Chat 3's dance was actually pretty short, but I figured I could double the length of it. The dance in Club Penguin was made out of 4 segments. Number 1, the spinning part, which was just a combination of standing and walking animation frames. Number 2, churn the butter, an entirely new animation that I figured would be well suited to a penguin's pudgy body. Number 3, sit sit wave, which was just made out of those animations. Number 4, sit sit bow, which was made out of existing animations as well. The bow is just the first few frames of picking up a snowball to throw it. And that was it. With very few frames, the penguin had a pretty versatile range of moves. Here's some of them now in 3D. Now you may be wondering, hey, that's an unusual piece of animation software to make those penguins. I've never seen it before. What is it? The tool was called Swift 3D, and it was just barely good enough to do what we needed it to do. It could create 3D models, though it only understood triangular faces to the mesh. It could create animations, but only by moving and rotating objects. Nothing complicated like bones, which are a staple of animation nowadays and frankly have been since the days of Toy Story. The lighting system in it was weird. The rotation system couldn't understand angles outside of the range of -180 to +180. Frankly, it was a pain. But why did we use it then? Because it did one thing superbly. It rendered 3D objects into Flash vector perfectly. And that's it. That's why we used it. Now, Swift 3D also had a plugin tool that you could add to a program called 3D Studio Max, which was far more sophisticated. But The budget for Club Penguin's initial build was tight, and that piece of software was around $1,000. And I figured I was probably going to be the only one using it anyway. All I needed for Club Penguin was to make about maybe 200 simplistic clothing items for tiny little penguins. It was cheaper, it was barely functional, but for what we needed and would ever need it for, it would be fine. The Penguin model itself has a few interesting features. For one thing, it's taller than you might expect, because it was rendered from a 45-degree angle above the Penguin. You, as a player, were looking down on the world, so it made sense to render it from an overhead sort of camera angle. Next, while I rebuilt some things like the body and feet to be a little more streamlined in its mesh, other parts, like the arms, were brought over directly from Lance Preeb's original model. For 2005 video game standards, the model has a very high polygon count, but it didn't matter because everything was pre-rendered anyway into Flash. The biggest mistake I made with the model was in the arms. I didn't put the pivot point in a good location for the shoulder, which meant that there was a lot of clashing when clothes were put on. You see how the arm doesn't mesh well with that coat? That type of thing had to be fixed later in Flash by hand, which was pretty simple to do, but still, it took some time to fix. But by the time I realized it was a problem, there were too many clothing items already rendered, so we were just stuck with it. Most clothing items were pretty easy to create. The clothing mesh didn't have to have high levels of detail. Again, tiny penguins. And once some clothing items were created, others used parts of those pieces of clothing as starting points. However, there were some clothing items that were made a little oddly. Take, for instance, this football helmet. Does that look like the face mask of a football helmet to you? That's because it was rendered like this, but then lines were added in Flash to better show what a face mask would actually look like. The only fully 2D clothing item in Club Penguin was the ghost sheet. Every frame of that was hand-drawn by me. And it took 3 times longer than any other clothing item at the time. It was worth it, of course. Swift 3D would not have been able to handle a sheet, but we always tried to avoid doing clothing that way in the future. Speaking of things that Swift 3D couldn't handle well, animation. It was not a good animation tool, and when I was finished animating the penguin's walk, dance, wave, and snowball throw, I was thankful that I would never have to animate anything more with it. How did special dances work? I'm glad you asked. So it started out with the creative team, who decided on a special dance that was needed. The penguin was animated doing the special dance, and that animation was rendered out. It was added to a unique frame in the penguin's Flash file. Each clothing item was animated doing the special dance. That animation was added to the same frame of the clothing item's Flash file. In code, if a player was wearing a special combination of clothing that corresponded to a special dance, they'd do it. Otherwise, it was just the regular dance for you. One note, most special dances were the 3D penguin doing something, but not all. Specifically, this breakdance. Swift 3D could not do that. It would have exploded. Another technical detail that I've always wanted to share is this. You know how the penguin had 2 layers so that it could change color? Well, there were actually 3 layers, but the third was never used. For the first few years of Club Penguin's existence, the tummy was on its own, completely unique layer. Why? Well, it was because of an idea that I had for optimization. I knew that some clothing items would be coming that would completely cover the penguin's body, like, say, the ninja suit. I thought we could have in code a collection of clothing items that would automatically get rid of the tummy. If we didn't have to render the tummy, maybe the game would run faster. We never used this feature. The number of clothing items that completely covered the tummy actually turned out to be very small, and the optimization was so small that it just wasn't worth it. Plus, it probably would have created a whole new category of no tummy glitches. As it was, there were a lot of layers to keep track of on each penguin. If a penguin was fully clothed at game's launch, there would have been layers for the head item, face item, body item, penguin body, and penguin color. In early 2006, we already saw that we'd left out some pretty important customization options, so we added layers for the hands, the neck, and the feet. The hand items in particular created a challenge for snowball throwing and dancing, and often we'd just lay the item down on the ground in front of the penguin when they were doing more complicated motions. Yeah, okay, laziness, but it was probably the right thing to do. One regret I have is that in 2006, when we added those other layers, I didn't think to suggest a back layer and a puffle walking layer. Those were the only big ones that we were really missing out on for the rest of Club Penguin's life. If we're going to talk about the penguin avatar, we have to talk about the paper doll, which was the name that we used in studio for the penguin used on the player card, compared to the 3D penguin that walked around the world. Now, when this paper doll penguin was created, you need to understand that Club Penguin did not have an art style. What should have happened is there should have been a series of drawings when we were narrowing down what the penguin art style was, and then we would make the paper doll based on that after we put in a lot of planning and sketches. What did happen was this. We need a penguin for the player card. I started with a very lazy idea, which was just taking the Swift render and making that look kind of illustrated. Lance didn't want that. He wanted a penguin with some more character to it. So I sketched out this. He said yes. And that's what we used. This illustration took like 15 minutes max. It looks nothing like the rest of the penguin art in the game. It is dumpy looking with this kind of clueless expression on its face, and its beak is a totally weird shape. It does not belong as a penguin avatar, which I guess has kind of made it iconic. Don't get me wrong, I like it. I just wish I'd approached that particular project differently. Again, I was 22 and very inexperienced, so that's why it looks like that. One regret: the arms. Why are they so short? They are the tiniest, stubbiest little arms. Do you know how much of a pain it is to actually put shirt sleeves on a penguin like that? I guarantee over time it would have gotten changed if it weren't for the fact that changing that penguin would have meant changing the paper doll art for all previous clothing items as well. And by the time we have several hundred other clothing items, like, no, that's stuck there. That's our penguin. We are stuck with that penguin for all time. But seriously, Disney princess outfits had to appear on this thing. How many Disney characters had to fit and shape onto this thing? And we never did Wheezy from Toy Story, which would have been perfect. What is the deal with that? Anyway, every new clothing item needed art for the paper doll, and separate art for the icon. And just like the clothing items, most of these were made by me from 2005 until early 2007, when Club Penguin's 5th, 6th, and 7th full-time artists were hired, and one of them showed interest in taking on clothing creation. Her name's Monique, and credit to Monique because I was showing her how clothing items were made, and she asked a very important question. Why do you make the 3D model first? Shouldn't you make the 2D illustration first and then the 3D model based on that? And I had no good answer for that because I was just focused on the technical hurdles of Swift 3D and what was possible in it, and I'd never considered actually starting by designing the clothes first. So we immediately switched that around, and she, along with other artists later on, started designing some gorgeous clothing items. All things considered, the Penguin avatar worked out really well for the first few years. Many cool or ridiculous items were created with it. But the system did start to show cracks after a while. Club Penguin's popularity exploded, which means that I was needed in more places. So other coworkers started making clothing items, and they were amazed at how quaint the system for making them was. Swift 3D was getting some updates at the time, but none that made modeling 3D items much easier. By the time mid-2010 hit, it had been 5 years since I'd devised the method for making the Penguin avatar. I wasn't even making clothing at all by that point, as I moved on to other things in the company, but I was aware that the people who'd taken over at Club Penguin were having a tough time working with the system that I built. And that bugged me. So, I asked permission to fix what I'd created imperfectly in 2005. I wanted to give the studio an easier way for the new artist to make Penguin clothing items. The company said yes, and I got to work. Gone was Swift 3D. In came 3D Studio Max. Remember how I said that a $1,000 license for 3D Studio Max was a little outside the company budget in 2005? Well, let's just say by the time 2010 hit, we had the budget for it. Yeah, but there was a hitch. There was no way to just export the Penguin in Swift 3D and import it into 3D Studio Max. That was simply impossible. The model of the Penguin, the 3D asset, could travel between programs, thankfully, but all of the lighting information, camera positioning, and most importantly, animation data could not be exported. It was stuck in Swift 3D. And if the Penguin wasn't in precisely the correct position for every single frame of its animation, all previous clothing items would not be compatible with the new Penguin. There would be weird-looking holes. They'd all have to be redone, and there were over 1,000 items on Club Penguin by this point, so that was not an option. So what do we do? If we can't export and import the animations, that would mean, like, creating an absolutely identical camera angle as was in Swift 3D pointed at the new 3D Penguin model, and then one frame at a time move and rotate each part of the Penguin as though it was stop motion into the proper position so that it would line up exactly with what was there in the original Penguin. That's craziness. That's what I did. Yeah. It only took about a week and a half to do it, to check and double check that everything was exactly right. And then I sent this new Penguin off to the clothing team. It was up to them to see what they could do with it, to see if this new way of working with the Penguin was an improvement over the old one. And since 3D Studio Max is actually quite decent animation software, it was a massive improvement. If any of you were players from late 2010 to 2013, did you happen to notice a big bump in the amount of clothing items that were produced, and the complexity of those clothing items, and the increased variety of special dances? It was because the clothing team finally had a Penguin that they could more easily work with. Anyone on the team with experience using industry-level 3D software could finally and fully put their skills to proper use. And they did. And that was special for me, because the Penguin avatar became the bookends of my time working at Club Penguin. I left Disney Online Studios Canada a few months later, and fixing the 3D Penguin was literally the last thing that I did for Club Penguin while I was an employee for the studio. In 2005, my first task was to make the Penguin work. And in 2010, my last task was to hand the Penguin off to the rest of the team. I don't have much else to say, except that I feel very blessed. This Penguin has been seen by hundreds of millions of people on planet Earth. And that is an incredible honor to me, that so many of you have taken the Penguin avatar and used it even now to this day as the image for your own social media posts. I still see it. I still see pictures of people using this Penguin to identify themselves online, even though Club Penguin hasn't been online officially for quite a while. Thank you for watching this video. If you made it all the way to the end, a double thanks to you. And the only thing I ask of you, be a voice of joy and hope in the world, please. There's a lack of that on the internet, and that needs to change. Treat people kindly and waddle on. I don't have much to say, except that I feel very blessed. This Penguin has by bleh,